Hey guys, I'm Joe Klemczewski, founder of the Diet Doc, and here with me today in a feature of Contest Prep University, the one and only Dr. Eric Helms.
Hello, thank you for having me on, man.
Eric, yeah, you know, you are one of my favorite bigs in the industry, so always a pleasure. I wanted to save a special topic for you because I really can't think of anybody who could address it any better. And it's all in the realm of research. So I want to go in a few different areas, but the reason this is so meaningful to me is I started my career on a clinical path. I never considered going into research. I always wanted to work with clients, work with patients. My whole career when I was in my 20s was to be focused on taking all of that complex information, making it usable for the consumer. This was pre anything we see today. So all of the research in the exercise science labs, human performance labs, all of the people like you who are now making careers out of academia in really taking nutrition and performance nutrition to the level it is now, that just didn't exist 25 years ago when I was starting. So in many ways, you're kind of living a career that I wish I would have been able to anticipate because I'm so jealous of you being able to do what you do. But at the same time, it's exciting to see. But I also can't think of anything that's more misused. So let me pose this question, and I'll see how you address it. The most cliche, maybe misused phrase I hear is evidence-based. There's nothing that smacks more of just virtue signaling and tribalism. Whenever I hear that term used by most people, they're just basically trying to say, whatever I believe is right, whatever you believe is wrong, science is on my side. And they have no idea what they're talking about. They're just picking out headlines, maybe the side or position of one of their favorite gurus in the industry, influencers, and they still have no idea what they're talking about. They're just parroting somebody else. So that's my cynical view of where we are right now. Tell me what you think.
I think that was a really good lead-in, Dr. Joe. I mean, you positioned yourself as a clinician and seeing, oh man, what could have been had I come around 10 years later, like me, or 20 years later. I was trying to save you some face of how old you actually are. But I think the career that I have one foot in, because I'm, still do a lot of work with athletes, and that's kind of where I started, is there to inform the clinician. And I think if anyone is engaging with quote unquote evidence-based practice, those people are clinicians inherently, and their ability to incorporate scientific research into their practice is one of three pillars of evidence-based practice that I think, like you're saying, kind of this bastardized social media, tribalized, cynical version of it is really just, hey, I have a few science-ish influencers who I follow, and I just repeat what they say, and that's just become that they're just the new guru who's using science. And I almost hesitate to say new guru, because man, if we go back to the very beginnings of monetizing physical culture, even back into the late 1800s and the birth of modern bodybuilding. If you've heard of Eugen Sandow, the Sandow Trophy, the first guy who went from being a vaudeville strongman circus act guy to saying, hey, look at my physique. He actually had Sandow's Cocoa, which was kind of the snake oil cure-all chocolate that he created and he marketed. And, he had a trainer who worked with him on and off. They had a tumultuous relationship, and they had a gym in New York, and they would definitely use science for marketing. And I think science as a marketing tool and as guruism and as a method of saying, hey, I'm right and I have this on my side, it's been around just as long, it's just as prevalent, and it's potentially just, if not more harmful than saying, hey, the biggest or strongest person is always right and you should do what they do. And I think it's unfortunate that the tagline evidence-based has become the embodiment of that, of what I like to call hashtag science or team science, because evidence-based actually has a pretty robust definition if we look at its roots, which is evidence-based medicine, which has been around for a lot longer in that field. And it essentially has three pillars, like I mentioned before. There is the preferences of the individual, there is your clinical experience, and then there is science. And they're meant to be not like these two throwaway things and then science, but three equal stools, like three equal legs to a stool kind of thing. And when you think about the nature of science, in that it shouldn't be used based on its philosophical roots as the end-all be-all answer, the black and white. It's rather, you're always addressing means, and you're speaking in probabilities. And most of the time, you can only get these generalizations that apply to the majority of the bell curve. While a clinician is looking for specific answers to a specific situation for a specific person right now. A surgeon is not going to go, well, you know what? I don't really care about your individual physiology. I just care whether the surgery works for most people, and I'm going to give you that. That obviously would create some problems. So evidence-based medicine addressed two issues. It addressed the fact that there were some healthcare practitioners who are not staying up to date and saying, hey, look, you really need to make sure you do stay abreast of the evidence in addition to your clinical practice. Like, you're using a method that went out of favor 20 years ago. We have a better alternative, even though you're very, very good at it. And it's kind of saying, hey, if we don't use empiricism and rational skepticism in the evolution of our understanding of science, then you will not be able to go from doing something good to then being better. If we think about early age medicine, we had doctors and nurses and healthcare practitioners in various fields who were really, really good at now out of date things. So they were the best practice of the time, but best practice evolves. And that's the way science should be used, rather than simply parroting things that someone who claims to have science on their side says. But I think what you're referring to is the other side of that coin, is science used inappropriately, where, I've seen stuff like this where a very, very high level athlete who's paid attention, or a very high level coach who's paid attention and is modifying things and individualizing programs and essentially doing observational in the trenches research in a case study model, which is what a good clinician is doing, if you think about it, which is valid. And then someone comes around and drops a PubMed link in and says, you're training wrong, because, something sort of similar to what you're doing was significantly worse than this other thing in this study that I don't understand the methods of, with an N of 4, So I think I'd like to think that just as much time in my career as I've spent engaging people with science and helping them know what to do, I've also tried to educate my audience on how to use science, misuses of science, and how to identify people who are using rational skepticism and are actually using empiricism in the way it's supposed to be, rather than using it for that fitness marketing that I think it's become a misuse of.
Yeah, you threw a lot out there, and let me back up a little bit and just say, if I could sit everybody in our profession down, every single person who is a fitness professional, and say, okay, everybody, we're gonna have a little meeting, and we're gonna create some best practices. The first thing I would say is, let's start engaging in a little humility in understanding that, as you said, science is evolving. We can do a study and we can say, well, gosh, here's what we found. Here are some of the challenges maybe with this study that we could improve on. Let's see if we can reproduce it. We got this answer, so now maybe we should ask this new question. And every step of the way, we are learning. We're not solving. We're not saying, okay, we've just put a dogmatic pillar in the ground, and now that is settled. Let's move on to something else. And yet the typical consumer, or the typical maybe not quite so educated professional in our industry, just picks up on those clickbait taglines, an answer that they got from some podcast, and they set their entire career or some form of methodology around that one point. In that, to me, is where we start creating these factions and these fights, and there's such a misapplication and a misunderstanding that I think, to our peril as a profession, we end up putting the consumers in these positions where they have to make decisions, and they also falsely feel like, okay, now I have it all figured out. And we all collectively miss this opportunity to just be open-minded and say, well, this is what we're working on now, and I'm finding that this is really valuable to me right now, but who knows what maybe next month or next year I'll be doing. And I'm really asking for, in our industry, some extra level of curiosity and humility. That's what I want to see evidence-based mean, that it's a process, not a final product.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think I'm always interested in how did we get here? And I do think a part of it I talked about is marketing. It's using science as really giving someone a safety blanket, saying, hey, science says this, therefore you can have trust and faith and buy-in for my program, my diet, my supplement, my whatever. And there are positive aspects of that. Buy-in's good. And humans don't really like to be uncomfortable. I think humility is a learned trait because confidence and false arrogance is a much more natural position to be in. Like, oh, I think I know, I have it figured out. And I think the people who get attracted, and so that's one part of it, is fitness marketing driving this. But I think another part of it is how education occurs. And there's a pretty big disconnect. Anyone who's gone through a graduate program where they start to engage with research and they go from your typical undergraduate program, there's a stark change in the way you start learning. One is rote memorization and textbooks, and then you start taking graduate classes and they may not even have a textbook. It may be you're going to check out the research on this topic and write a paper. And all of a sudden you're expected to learn critical thinking as a 21-year-old after not really being taught it throughout your entire education, at least in the States I can speak for. And I think that's one thing that any science communicator needs to do. And one thing that I cannot stand if there's a quote unquote science communicator who all they do is spend their time myth busting and debunking. Because for one, they're never telling someone what to do. They're just telling them what not to do. And they're never telling them, here's what you need. Here's the tools you need. But I'm just going to, I'm just going to become your filter. I don't want you to develop any critical thinking skills. Just come to me and I'll tell you whether X, Y, Z product, idea, or influencer is BS or not. And then it becomes about ego. It often takes a bad turn. It becomes about confrontation rather than curiosity. And again, it's like this inversion. You're becoming the guru because you're criticizing all these false gurus. You're like the anti-guru guru. And I think instead, a much more important service to do as a quote unquote science communicator is to not only just give science, out, like here are some interesting findings, but to position them not as the truth in the light and black and white, but position them in the broader context of understanding and to the true subjective limits of what they can tell us, given the way probability works, and then to also spend an equal amount of time teaching people to develop rational skepticism, teaching people science literacy. Like people who follow me, they know what examine.com is. They know where they can find these unbiased reviews of supplements. They know that the journal of that the JISSN is open access. They know that a meta-analysis is probably the closest thing we can get to a good understanding of a broad topic. They know that position stands from some of these scientific bodies are some of the more lay-friendly reading. And I spend a lot of time when I write a mass article for our monthly research review. It's not just here's what the study says and you can do for practice. That's there, but I also talk about some things they can learn about the methods, what the limits of it, and where I might disagree with the authors because they over or under concluded based on what they had. So I think there needs to be a significant change in the way that people think about science. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people who are attracted to the hard sciences, especially like biology and physiology, they are people who were good at math. They like answers. They like to color within the lines, and they like to see the world in understandable ways. So they are attracted to explanations which tend to be too black and white for the nature of what science is. And because we have gotten further and further away from teaching philosophy, teaching logic, and teaching the underpinnings of where empirical thought came from, people see philosophy and like quantitative science and philosophy are two different things. Like philosophers are silly. They just sit on a rock and a stone and they talk about this stuff. But the underpinnings for where rational skepticism, empiricism, and the actual process of observation and measurement and the whole quantitative methodology of science came from these philosophies. Okay, how do we get as close as possible to understanding what might be true? And then how can we analyze that and discuss it? And the fundamental truth there that you were getting at is that science constantly evolves. And I think the echoes of this disconnect between the underlying philosophy and quantitative science itself is seen all the time when people get frustrated. Like, what do people say? Like, you know what? I stopped following science because it seemed to be different every month. Carbs are good. Carbs are bad. Pre-workout matters. Pre-workout doesn't matter. I can't listen to science. I want the answers. And the underlying assumption, the subtext there is, I'm expecting science to be right. I want a truth and the light, and I want the world to be black and white. And I think what isn't well communicated is that science is supposed to change. It's supposed to evolve. We're supposed to be moving closer and closer and closer to things that resemble the truth in more cases than not, or having a more nuanced, better description of how things operate. Rather than, we've done the study, we got P less than 0.05, and now we know that answer. Let's close that book, and we're never going to study resistance training or nutrition again. We're going to close the doors in every college. No need to study this. We figured it out. Game over. Mission accomplished.
And I think that is a great point. It almost brings in politics into this, where people get angry about discord and debate, and that is the essence of what creates progress. Now, it can be civil and it can be sane, but you brought up empiricism and philosophy, and I think, like a lot of other hard scientists, my favorite Enlightenment philosopher was David Hume, who is kind of known as the father of empiricism. And so I do have this bent toward, I do want to look for accuracy and inaccuracy and make sure that I can decide what is valid and what's not. But this is where I think if I could come back to just the lay consumer and say, your words, Eric, of just being a good critical thinker and a rational skeptic, we have to understand that our brains have evolved for bias. And even bias it can be thought of as a good thing, because in an evolutionary sense, we're trying to get to safety as fast as possible. So if I, for example, am a fan of Eric Helms, I don't have to understand all of this science. I don't have to read every meta-analysis. But if I just read in a post that this is what Eric believes, I can say, okay, boom, I believe that too now, because I trust Eric. And that, again, is not inherently bad. That bias saves us a lot of time, and it gets us information that can get us to security and truth. But at the same time, you still have to recall that Eric might be wrong once in a while. I mean, I hate to, maybe not, but
it's at least theoretically possible. I could be wrong.
That's a perfect way to state it. It is theoretically possible. But I'm reading a book right now. There's a Stanford psychology professor. I think she was a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and she wrote this new book called Biased. And again, it goes through how we're either going to believe or not believe based on these heuristics that we just create in our mind. Whoever we follow and trust already, or distrust, we automatically categorize that as right or wrong. And in research, if we just had that little nugget of open-mindedness to say, okay, this gives me a starting point. I trust this person, or I really distrust this person, but let me dig a little bit deeper. Let me use my own brain. And you just don't have to be a scientist to come up with some good critical thinking skills. You can find ways. And you brought up, two other legs of that stool, one of which is your own experience, and context. And you can say, well, this is within the realm of possibility. And even though there may not be 5,000 studies on it, it sure seems to work for me. So that at least gets me to a hypothesis level in the scientific method, and I can continue to look down that field. But if I could turn your attention, Eric, really quick to in the type of research that you find most valid in our industry, let's kind of narrow that down to just performance nutrition. What's going to help people with strength, hypertrophy, athleticism? What do you feel is the most beneficial type of research happening right now?
That's a great question. I think first off, let me just say I agree with everything you're saying, and so bias comes from pattern recognition. Right? And the scientific method and well-done research is simply a systematic more objective way of doing pattern recognition and actually seeing, does this really statistically create a pattern? And then what confidence do we have around it? So yeah, they're really two sides of the same coin. And I think we shouldn't just look at bias as a negative. So as far as what research do I think is most useful, I think some of the meta-analytic data coming out right now is most useful to the practitioner because it actually can influence practice. It gets them in the ballpark of where to start before they start individualizing things, which is, another leg of the stool. And it typically is the more understandable by the lay reader. So what a meta-analysis is, it is what it sounds like. It's an analysis of the global data on a given topic. So people are probably familiar with like reviews on a topic. I know when I first started to read research, the ones that I was able to connect with the most were reviews because they were written typically about application on a given topic, especially in the field of like sports science, performance nutrition. And they basically only had the sections of studies that I understood. Back in the day before I was an actual researcher, when I would read a study, I'd read the introduction and I could understand the background on something. The methods and results were totally confusing because I didn't understand what went on in the lab. So the methods didn't make sense. I didn't understand stats, so that didn't make any sense. And then the results, which are different than the discussion, are just the raw data interpreted statistically. So I basically just read the introduction and then I skipped to the discussion and the conclusion. And if it sounded logical, I would just trust that the methods and the results were done properly. And that is kind of where everyone has to start. Especially clinicians who they might understand the topic, these complex physiological topics, like, glycogen replenishment and carbohydrate loading or substrate utilization, but they don't know how it's measured in a lab because that's not what they do. They don't know how it's statistically analyzed to tell whether it's valid and to what magnitude and what confidence. So the introduction, discussion, fair game. And I think that's why a meta-analysis is useful because it's not a study. It is an analysis of all the studies on a given topic that are close enough that they can be treated as semi-homogeneous and they're analyzed together. And then we also deal with some of the other issues in research. So sports science is notoriously underpowered. And what that means is just we struggle to get a fairly good sample size. So for example, I'm specifically a bodybuilding and powerlifting researcher. These are the nichest of niche sports. And if you want to do a study on bodybuilders, good luck doing a randomized controlled trial. At best, what you can do is do an observational study, categorize people, and maybe do a couple different cross-sectional analyses. And, and you're going to have an N of like 5. There's a reason why 80% of the studies on bodybuilders and physique athletes are case studies, individual design, where you get good, high-quality data on an individual over time. You can't make generalizations about bodybuilders because of that. And hell, you probably shouldn't, because what they do in Brazil is very different than what you do in the United States, very different than the UK. But anyway, the data we have on high-performance athletes, especially in niche sports, is pretty much, there's only so much you can do with an individual study. But if you can collate it all together, and then you can look for trends in the broader data, that's when you can really start to say something. And that's some of what I feel is my most important work that I've published are these evidence-based recommendations for bodybuilding that we've tried to update over time. And some of the reviews I've written where we collate all the data on a given topic and say, hey, here's our best interpretation of this, and here's what it might mean for a practitioner. And so for example, the meta-analysis and these position statements, I'd say they are the most useful to a practitioner because they have less jargon. They have less things that you will be unfamiliar with, and they're generally made, at least on average, more open access, and they're using a larger pool of data to have a little more confidence behind the conclusions.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the limitations of some of those single studies in our industry, but I love the meta-analysis first point of contact because one of the things that I answer all the time, probably a dozen times a week, somebody is emailing saying, hey, what about this? This new study came out. What do you think? And I'll instantly say, well, how does that fit into all of the other data that we have? And I love to tell people, if you are really interested in this sport, whether you're just a high performer or you are a budding professional, get your hands on a couple different types of biochemistry textbooks, physiology textbooks, because talk about meta-analysis. even though these are just a point in time of their own context, you're looking at, maybe one chapter where 50 different people contributed and edited, and they may have sifted through 500 different studies. And so they've done literature reviews on every aspect of that particular topic. You can't get much more robust of a meta-analysis than a textbook like that. The limitation, of course, being, once that's published, it's kind of frozen in time, and anything after that, is fair game to new interpretation. But without that, if you just do look at those individual studies, not only is it a small N value, not only do we, can we not get 500 bodybuilders doing the same thing in the same lab to be tested? Isn't one of the greatest limitations the fact that we're doing 6 and 12-week studies, and some of the things that we're trying to interpret, we really want to extrapolate out and say, this is the best thing to do for your career. And yet we're going to base that all on this little window of time.
Yeah, I'll give you some really good examples of that. So if you go take any sports nutrition class at any level, you'll be told that the two most quote unquote evidence-based or scientifically studied supplements are creatine and caffeine. And if you take any pre-workout supplement, I would bet my money that it's going to have one, if not both of those ingredients in them. And the supplement manufacturer is going to be very confident that that's going to be driving most of the effects, regardless of what they may market. And those are surefire, like well-analyzed, like we're talking double-digit number of meta-analyses have been done on creatine and caffeine. But get this, there's actually never been a published study that I'm aware of that looks at long-term adaptations with caffeine usage to see whether it enhances strength or hypertrophy. It's all short-term studies. Yet we just assume that if I can enhance acute performance, if we carry that over time, it's going to make me stronger because I'm performing better over time. That may be true, but it may not. And there's been plenty of times in the research where that hasn't happened. So even when we're talking about arguably one of the most studied supplements on the planet that is quote unquote evidence-based, there are huge gaps in the research, especially for someone who's interested in like hypertrophy or fat loss in the way it's been studied. Another huge glaring issue is that, most S&C coaches, they can tell you everything about periodization. They'll be taught, they'll throw Russian last names at you. They'll throw like Leo Matveev. They'll talk about conjugate. They'll talk about linear. They'll talk about block. They'll talk about Assurin. They'll talk about Bondichuk. They'll talk about Franz Bosch, all this stuff. And they'll have this incredible amount of theory. But guess what? Periodization is typically talking about macrocycles. That's the realm of periodization, is when we're looking at long-term adaptations in high-level athletes. And do you know how many periodization studies there are that last longer than 6 months that are on high-level athletes? I think there might be one, So this entire field is based on these layered assumptions that are based on these acute studies, and the average training study lasts 8 weeks. So that's basically maybe 2 mesocycles, if they're shorter mesocycles at most, that we have an entire field built on. And the rest are these opinion papers and these theorists taking shots at one another. There's kind of a famous series of these narrative reviews of block and undulating and linear theorists taking shots at each other, who led as the editor. So right. I think we often even scientists and theorists forget the limits of science, and they take these quote unquote foundational concepts and they keep layering them. But at every level of that multi-layered cake, there's an opportunity for an error. And there's an opportunity for something that should have evolved that hasn't. A great example in periodization literature is it's all built on some of the fundamental physiological concepts of stress and stuff from the 50s that, of course, because S&C coaches aren't physiologists, they haven't updated their concepts of stress. So you get this very top-down input-output approach that has come all the way into the 2000s with periodization, while the stress researchers are going, wait, you guys are still talking about stress like that? What about someone who's emotionally stressed? They heal at 1/2 the rate. Like, how are you thinking you're doing all this complex programming? You're supposed to hit a PR 24 weeks from now, but you haven't taken into account the fact that you might have showed up for that max testing session after being stuck in traffic and arguing with your wife, and you're not going to hit a PR for that reason. And only now, 50, 60 years later, we're starting to see coaches and theories and approaches that take a bottom-up kind of an emergent approach of going, right, we have this system, but it needs to adapt or be auto-regulated based on the realities of what's going on in general life. So that was a bit of a tangent, but I think it illustrates that it can sometimes take decades before multidisciplinary research goes in the quote unquote right direction because of some of these limitations.
And, to your point, I love what you're talking about in terms of the limitations of that data being taken out that long. I've answered this question so many times with creatine. If it was so amazing, if you get so much gain when you start creatine for so long, why is everybody who, started it in the 1990s, why aren't they 500 pounds of pure muscle by now? If there was such great, amazing results. I mean, yes, of course, we can measure these acute things. We understand what it does, resynthesizing ATP and all that, but what is it truly beneficial for? But I want to bring you back to something you just said, because we do want to at least think we can be as empirical as possible. And in the lab, there are certain things we can measure. If I want to reproduce Newton's law of gravity, I can do some tests, and I can say, based on the laws of physics, here's exactly what is true. How beneficial that is may not be as applicable as some of these long-term reviews. The Harvard review on happiness that went for 75 years and followed people through their entire lifetime. And they were able to say, based on survey analysis, not lab controlled, controlled peer-reviewed research, but just surveys. Here is what we found in the entire lives of these tens of thousands of people. That is not exactly empirical, but it's sure pretty freaking valuable. I mean, it points us in a direction where we can make a lot of not just assumptions, but some pretty clear decisions on what would help people. And I think of the National Weight Control Registry, closer to what we're talking about today. Another long-term, study process where by this point, it's been a couple of years since I've looked into it, but I think they're probably up to about 30 years where people who want to be a part of this registry have to have lost at least 30 pounds, kept it off for at least a year. At the time I reviewed it, the average person had been in the study for longer than 5 years and had lost over 70 pounds. And so they look at these variables and they say, okay, what's the common denominator, the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characteristics of all of these people who are successful weight maintainers? Again, that is not a 6 or 12-week study in a lab with highly controlled variables, but that is some amazing information to have over that amount of time with that many subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, essentially what you're talking about is laboratory control versus ecological validity, which is a complex way of saying, we can drill down to a mechanism and be very precise, reliable, and know how something works, but we will have to take it outside of the context of the real world. And there's value in both these small size, short-term laboratory-based studies, and also these big picture, long-term, real-world associations that we see in epidemiology, which is kind of what you're describing. And the issues are typically when someone tries to interpret either end of the spectrum, like they're on the other side. Like most personal trainers are going to get in trouble, not when they state what they notice anecdotally, but when they try to explain it. My clients, when they do a lot of high reps, they get a little leaner. I'm pretty sure what's happening is high reps make the muscle get more striated, or makes those fat cells, get smaller. It's like, well, maybe high reps produces more total work and that burns more calories. And also they do it when they go on a cut, so they're modifying their nutrition. So you were fine until you tried to explain the mechanism, and I think that is the real value there, is that when you look at the weight control registry, or when you look at these huge studies or surveys that last years and take a look at a broad amount of data, you basically get a really, really strong signal, and you're able to overcome the noise, and you can be very confident in the associations you observe. But you can't necessarily say, and here's the mechanism. Mm-hmm. But man, success leaves clues. It can point you in a lot of different directions, and it can allow you to make decisions as a practitioner, more importantly. For example, if we were to consistently see that a certain macronutrient setup, which is not true, unfortunately, produced fat loss reliably among everyone, great, we could have them do that. We couldn't say, oh, and by the way, it's because of, fat oxidation being higher or something like that. And that's great. I think the best coaches over time, that's what they're doing. They have good pattern recognition skills. They're able to do it with multiple athletes over time and figure out how to use it on an individualized level. They don't always necessarily know why it works. And that's great. That's fine. We often don't. But the lab-based stuff can be useful because if we can find out the mechanism, then we can figure out which of our behaviors that we're trying to encourage or adopt or apply, which of our strategies are required and which are just correlational. Like a great example would be if every time before you opened the door and walked into your house, you walked in circles 3 times. And that just for some reason had to happen for you to open the door. But if you did the study and you found out, I could just open the door and walk through, you can let go of all that circular stuff. A good example would be that when you compare large-scale studies of vegetarians to anyone just on a regular Western diet, if you go to a mall right now, and this has been done, and you just do surveys of people who self-identify as vegetarians, and you do surveys of people who are not, and you wait until you get 2,000 people, huge sample size for a lot of statistical power, you're going to see much better health outcomes in the vegetarians. Now, does that mean that you have to do everything a vegetarian does to get that benefit? And does that mean that eating animal products is unhealthy? No, because then we have these other studies where they start to control for those variables. And they go, right, let's take vegetarians and give them comparable controls. And that's when we start to see, oh, shoot, vegetarians in general are more diet conscious. People who are more diet conscious tend to have a lower BMI. People who are more diet conscious also tend to exercise. Oh, people who are diet conscious and exercise and have a lower BMI tend not to smoke or drink. So all these other things are quote unquote confounding variables, or at least contributing variables to why they're healthier. So when you take non-vegetarians who eat a lot of fruits and vegetables though, but they're still consuming animal products, who exercise, don't smoke, don't drink, and have a comparable BMI, all of a sudden those differences go away. And then you can start to think a little deeper and go, oh, hold on. So it's probably not the exclusion of animal products, but the inclusion of fruits and vegetables. And you can look at the short-term studies that show that the phytonutrients in fruits and vegetables have these beneficial health effects. And maybe only certain classes of animal products, like highly processed red meat or burned meat or things like that, are carcinogenic or contribute to things, or those that are very high in saturated fat, or when it creates an overall higher calorie intake, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to understand the limitations on both sides and to not treat the observational research like it is a controlled trial, to not treat correlation like it's causation, and likewise not to take some of these highly sanitized, low-powered but accurate studies in the lab and think you can do much with them. The whole area of protein timing is a great example of extrapolating based on data that's probably only relevant in a lab. If you come to me for a 12-hour study and all I give you for those 12 hours, after you've been fasted for 12 hours, is 80 grams of whey, yeah, the best way to get the most protein synthesis under the curve is to give you 20 grams every 4 hours or so. But in reality, you've got a conga line of food going through. You've got lipids, you've got fiber slowing down digestion, you've got fluids. You're not eating whey, the fastest digesting protein known to man. You're eating all kinds of mixed meals, and you're taking in way more than 320 calories from 80 grams of protein the whole day. You're taking probably 10 times that amount. And now all of a sudden, those very clear peaks and valleys become kind of this steady, almost shallow wave. And it doesn't matter, to the same degree at least, what the protein timing is in most cases. So it's true, but it's only true in a very limited context.
I think your description of correlation with the vegetarian study, sample that you gave, in terms of if we say that vegetarians are healthier than meat eaters, but then you go through all this list, well, most vegetarians would also be diet conscious beyond that. They probably also care more about their health in general, so maybe they avoid other types of pollution, toxicity, et cetera. I think that's one of the biggest points that people miss as consumers is when they read a headline from any news source and they say, oh, this equals that, they just don't know how to look through those things, those prisms. But I would say one of the last obstacles we have, especially as people trying to be good consumers of research, is not just our own biases and what stories we want to believe, but to realize that the people conducting the research have their own built-in biases that are sometimes career-long challenges. If you've built your entire career, you've gotten grants, you've gotten tenured because of your position on something, and then that slowly erodes and is found to be maybe not quite so objectively true, a lot of times those guys are going to fight like hell to try and prove and cherry pick data to hang on to something that just was never valid in the first place. So now all of a sudden you have these arguments and debates between people that we would call titans of research. And now who do you believe? And so, I would ask you to kind of wrap this up. If you could flash forward 30, 40 years, Dr. Eric Helms is now retiring. He's contributed everything he can to this industry. What questions would you like to have seen answered, and where would you like to see the emphasis of research go in the kind of performance-based nutrition that you and I are involved in?
Man, that's a great question, and then B, a great lead-in. And I think the only downside to what you suggested earlier, that reading textbooks while they are kind of locked in time, or reading reviews or meta-analyses like I suggested, is that you do have to buy into the biases that are among the authors. And the meta-analysis and the 40 different editors being involved, it does get through some of that. But sometimes it can be quite embedded because of those things you talked about. And I think the solution to that is that scientific publishing has to change. We need to stop rewarding novel data and just start rewarding data. And also not necessarily rewarding in the actual academic structure of employment, those big novel findings, but rather high quality information that helps us get closer to the truth, even if it's not significant. I mean, that sometimes non-significant results are the most important because it challenges a convention that we believe to be true. A really good example, briefly, before I directly answer your question, would be, we used to have the entire training approach to hypertrophy based on what was called the hormone hypothesis, which started in the late 80s, early 90s, with a very, very prominent S&C researcher who noticed these correlations between the acute changes in testosterone, growth hormone, and cortisol in response to training. And now we understand that that has a lot more to do with the energy substrate utilization and dealing with the energy cost of exercise. But when you have someone do multiple sets of 10 with short rest periods, that does also produce robust hypertrophy because you're doing a lot of volume of effective work, but it also increases these hormones. And that's kind of the confusion of correlation for causation. And we went down this whole rabbit hole for 2 decades of what can we do to maximize growth hormone output, forgetting that it's more about, maybe there's a strong volume association. And yes, volume is higher workload, which requires more energy substrate to produce it. But you really want to get growth hormone to go up, run repeated 400-meter sprint intervals. But I don't think that's going to make your legs as big as, say, a 5x5, which will produce very low growth hormone output. So anyway, very important point. And I think what I would like to see answered would be more understanding of how variables interrelate in resistance training, instead of us isolating variables and then trying to see which is better. I think that often creates more questions than it answers. So for example, if you were to do a study with a fixed frequency and then have high, moderate, and low volume, if that frequency is very low, so you have to pile all of that volume into a single day, then you might see that a lower volume is better because you're going way past what you can handle in a single session. And then you compare that to a different study that has maybe like a full body split, so that the per session body part specific volume is lower and it's spread out differently. You might see there's a positive association with volume. So I think more creative designs where we're able to look at the interaction between variables that we're always dealing with in the real world, I think it will probably have a lot more value. And it's a little more difficult to do, as science often asks us to compare A versus B, and then there's the kind of that implicit thing of therefore one must be better than the other. But what about A plus B, or A with a little bit of B, or B with a little bit of A? And I think that requires us to look at science differently. I would love to see us shifting a little bit more away from null hypothesis testing and more just reporting of statistics and being honest with the subjective nature of it, and just saying, hey, the data seem to go this way, and here's some stats around it, but you get to decide as you read it, what are you going to do with that? And I think some scientists are going, well, we can't expect the lay public to understand those, and do that. But the stats are actually simpler when you do that. If I just report a mean and a standard deviation and a confidence interval and an effect size, and you go, what do you think? you can do that. But if I tell you I did a linear mixed model and then I had to do Bonferroni post hoc test, and therefore p less than 0.05 after the adjustment, we think it's significant. What does that mean? But if you took even a high school level stats course or did a little bit of reading online, I think understanding things like the average and the distribution of that average is a lot more easy to understand. So anyway, that's kind of a roundabout question, but I would love to see a greater understanding of how variables interact. How does some of these like nonlinear dieting approaches that you and I have used for decades, like refeeds, diet breaks, high carb days, low carb days, in conjunction with a calorie deficit over time compared to, a different approach work. And I think it's going to require a lot of repeated studies changing, one variable, then looking at it all together. And it's going to require, basically a lot of these kind of case series models and then drawing data from it together. But I'd love to see more information about how variables interacting with both nutrition for fat loss and nutrition for muscle gain, and then also training programs, how the interaction between multiple variables impacts things. Because like you said, every time you see two studies that conflict one another, there is some other aspect of them that's different. And they go, well, why didn't they control for that? And it's like, maybe they shouldn't control for it. Maybe that should be the actual thing they're investigating, which requires creativity. But I think it's really the only question that actually helps us, in my opinion.
Well, a foundation of your answer is kind of circling back to that humility of saying, look, let's just put the research out there and say, we may not know exactly what this means, so let's not pretend to, and then try and therefore, win more grant money or something, just put it out there and say, this is what it is, and then keep going. So the amazing thing about that is you are a driving force to create that. I can't tell you how many people that I have spoken with who, look to you and other people and say, wow, this has made science fun. This makes me want to do this. And I know people who have gotten into master's and PhD programs just because they love the way that you can communicate science. So you're becoming, to me, kind of the Neil deGrasse Tyson of physiology. Bringing that down to people's level where you really make it fun and understandable, and you want to read more. I mean, who would have said that 10 or 20 years ago? About science, and yet here we are. I would have never even conceived that would happen 25 or 30 years ago when I was starting my career.
Well, I just really appreciate that. And the more I've thought about this over time, it seems like it should be relatively low hanging fruit. Like guys like Carl Sagan have been around, and like you said, NGT, like they've been around forever making really complex science that has very little application at all. Quite interesting. Like, it's cool to know about the theory of relativity and how long it would take us to actually get to Alpha Centauri, but it doesn't look like we're going to get there anytime soon. We're not going to have to worry about colonizing other planets, but man, you've got millions of people wrapped with attention reading science fiction just because science is freaking cool when you hypothesize that stuff. I've been reading hard sci-fi since I could read. So if they can do that with these concepts that have literally zero true application in life, then why can't we do the same with like exercise and things that are having massive implications on our health, economy, happiness, and the direction of our society? To me, it's just a matter of we have to start thinking of this stuff as just, it's cool to nerd out. Like, that's like, why not, right? And instead of presenting it as tribalism, like you said, or black and white answers, I think the thing that has always hooked me when I've read stuff by Carl Sagan or listened to NGT talk or all these guys, that they have a certain wonder and curiousness and openness, and like, oh, this is like, science is cool because it's looking at mysteries. And the difference between that is stark when you compare it to like kind of the gurus that became popular in the 90s of, here's science, I have the truth and the light, and I'm going to lead everyone to training my way or doing nutrition my way. And you never hear like Carl Sagan talk about like, here's the only way to understand black holes and everyone else is an idiot. Like that's not a thing. So I think there's a lot to take from that kind of approach to science communication, rather than the debunking confrontational style that in some ways is diametrically opposed to the underlying philosophy.
Yeah, and now you have absolutely completely closed the loop to where we started, which is, I mean, there are basically going to be two approaches to science. One is dogmatism, right and wrong. One is open-minded curiosity, looking for the best questions and moving it forward. So process versus conclusion. And I think that's why, number one, you and I get along so well, but I think that's also why a lot of people are getting more interested in it. So before we go on for another hour, let me just stop you there, Eric, and say thank you so much for taking your time. I know you're on exactly the other side of the world from me right now, and yet here we are chatting about how to actually consume and apply research. So thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. And since we actually live on a flat Earth, I don't agree with you on that last point, but that can be for another podcast.
You're just right around the corner from me, probably. Yeah.
That's right. Just don't go too far; you'll fall off. So.
All right, man. And thank you guys for watching, listening. As always, please, who doesn't already follow Eric Helms? But we will put Eric's information in the show notes and some of the things that you may know about him. So we will chat with you guys again soon, and we'll let Dr. Helms go, and we'll move on.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.